Welcome back. We are back at it with trying to produce pre-release Victoria 3 content that is largely speculative, thinking through ideas, and kind of just to tide me over for the game. The game drops in 4 days, but also very importantly, the embargo on content for content creators that have been had early access to the game lifts in 3 days. And so once that happens, I don't think there will be much need for me to do stuff like this. And so we are going to be taking a look at all of the tutorials released by Paradox Grand Strategy. If you want to watch the tutorials without my commentary, feel free to stop this video and check them out, because that will be better if you don't want any interruptions. But I'm going to give my thoughts on these videos, as well as some of the game mechanics and stuff like this, and we'll see how it goes. Let's jump in with goods and resources, which
Hey
seem
folks,
the basis.
my name is Ezekiel Cohen, and I run the Call Me Ezekiel YouTube channel, where we create...
In the comments, there seems to be some controversy about this guy. I'm not very familiar with the controversy, but if you like drama, you could maybe check out the comment selection on this video, or look into this guy. I don't have any skin in that game.
high-quality videos about history, philosophy, literature, and the humanities at large. But most of you probably know me from that time I taught hundreds of thousands of you how to play Victoria 2. Now, I'm collaborating with Paradox Interactive to teach you how to play its sequel. So you can call me Ezekiel. This is how to use goods and resources in Victoria 3. Let's jump in! There are 4 types of goods in Victoria 3. Staple, industrial, luxury, and military.
I think early on in a run, you're going to want to try and focus mainly on staple to start getting the standard of living of your pops going up, to increase literacy, and to just kind of start cranking things out.
These goods feed your population, fuel your economy, enrich your people, equip your military, and give you life-ruining addictions. Okay, that last one isn't so great, but it's not a real problem because I can quit anytime I want. The first use of goods is meeting your population's needs. Each pop has various needs which they'll try to fulfill by buying goods. If they're able to get these goods, then they'll become wealthier. Wealthier pops are more productive, more fecund, and more loyal to their government.
I think this is one thing that's tremendously interesting about Victoria 3. In most games, what you try and do is you just try and extract as much wealth and money as possible. And so what you care about is how much money that's going into the treasury, but that does not seem to be the case in Victoria 3. When you are taking money into the treasury, let's say on a tariff or on a tax, you are removing that money from the circulation of the economy. And so, for example, your pops will no longer have access to as much money, so their consumption rate will go down, which will decrease the demand for goods, which will drive down the price of goods, which will make your industries less profitable, and you just have this cascading effect. So it can be the case that you actually want to, as the player, as the government, take less money into your treasury, because taking it into your treasury means removing it from the economy. And so you have this trade-off where if you take money into the treasury, I think the main benefit is you can do more construction. You can pay for more construction, which also employs pops. And the downside is you're removing money from the economy. And so I think the way you want to try and think about it, maybe, is that you want to be thinking about which interest groups are getting the money. Because passing laws, or getting the laws you want, seems pretty important. And so you want to try and foster an economy that gives the money to the interest groups you care about, and takes the money, and when it comes to situations where you're talking about the interest groups you care less about, you try and take their money, or you try and make sure that they get less money, and that's where you extract money for the treasury. And so being targeting particular areas seems a lot more important in Victoria 3, as opposed to most games in the economy you just want to go burr.
Although they will also demand more luxurious goods, which is very ungrateful of them. On the other hand, if they can't fulfill their needs, they'll become increasingly destitute, sterile, unproductive, and radicalized. But they'll also have lower expectations, making it easier to get back in their good graces.
This is an effect that I find really interesting, is that, as he is saying, your pops radicalize or become loyalist based on their change in their relative change in wealth. So a pop that moves from 9 to 10 in terms of standard of living will be really happy with you, and they'll be happier with you than a pop that moves from 20 to 19 because they had a decrease in the standard of living. So it's all relative, which means it could be the case that what you want to do is just have slow, steady growth in standard of living. Okay, so how do you try and do this as a player? Well, for example, if you make a new production method for making basic clothes such that your clothing supply is going to shoot up, this will shoot down the price of clothing, making it easier for your pops to buy more clothes, which will increase the standard of living. Something you could do is, as you implement that production method, you say to yourself, hey, I want this to be a little bit slower in terms of the benefit my pops are going to get. You could institute a tax on clothing as you dramatically increase the supply of clothing temporarily for a few months to try and get more of an even increase in standard of living. I think that this might be going too in depth, or too nitpicky / over managing. But it's possible that these sorts of things and interventions are going to be effective in game on the basis of, it's a relativistic calculation. Also, perhaps you want to try and, if you don't have a lot of radicals and you're not gaining radicals, you want to do stuff that pisses your pops off, or what's the way to put this? If you know the standard of living is going to have to go down, let's say you're going to declare a war, then maybe you want to, a year before the war, institute a bunch of taxes, lower the standard of living, but lower it a little bit, and then when you go to war, get rid of the taxes, coast off the increased treasury. That way the decrease in the standard of living will be more level. Some food for thought.
Certain goods do get treated a little differently by pops, such as being substitutable like in the case of basic foods, or being more or less likely to purchase them if it's a cultural taboo or an obsession. The British, naturally, have an obsession with tea, while the Chinese are obsessed with opium. Meanwhile, Arabs have a taboo against alcohol.
I've talked about this a little bit, that when you have a taboo against a certain product, this might actually be a product that you want to focus on exporting in your country. Now, obviously, you want to export it because you want to get rid of it, but I mean, focus on producing a ton of it and then exporting it. And the reason being, you just take away the export tariff, you try and drive up the price in your market, and then you export it. And the thing is you don't care if the price is high because your pops aren't consuming it. And so it doesn't really affect their standard of living. And I talked about this specifically in the case of, I think the grain farms also make alcohol. And so what you can do is you can take away the export tariff, so you're not charging other countries to import alcohol from you. And then this drives up the price of alcohol, which makes the farms, which are producing alcohol, more profitable. In doing this, you can have more farms, which will increase the supply of their other output, grain, which lowers the price of grain, which makes it so that your pops can get grain for cheaper, which increases their standard of living. So I think in the cases of productions that have bifurcated or multiple goods that are output, it might be the case that you try and drive up the price of one so that you can lower the price of the other.
The other use of goods is to supply buildings as input goods so they can be turned into output goods. We'll go further into detail on how this works in our next video. And finally, for the alleged good of its people, the government also consumes goods. It does this through government buildings. In fact, in all of these supply chains, the very first goods come from your states. Each state has arable land and resource potentials. Arable land is the maximum amount of agriculture a state can handle. Resource potentials determine what and how much of each natural resource you can extract. So if you want to produce coal, you can only do it in a state with coal as a resource potential, and you can't produce more than the limit allows. It's also possible to discover gold, oil, and rubber in your provinces, which will add them as resource potentials. The chances of finding them can be increased with certain technologies.
It's a little bit interesting. My understanding is rubber comes from rubber trees, and so that it's a discoverable good in the same way oil and gold are. It seems a bit strange, but okay.
You can find information on where each good's resource potentials are, where it's being produced, and where it's being consumed on that good's information page, which is most easily reached from the market panel. As you can see, places like Sicily are rich in sulfur, while warm weather crops like coffee aren't really grown in the frigid north. But only the most basic goods can be produced from your states. Superior tools, luxurious goods, and the most powerful weapons need to be manufactured. This is done in buildings, and will be the subject of our next video. I'll see you then.
So that was goods and resources. Now we're going to jump into the next one, which is, as he mentioned, buildings.
Hey folks, my name is Ezekiel Cohen, and I run the Call Me Ezekiel YouTube channel, where we create high-quality videos about history, philosophy, literature, and the humanities at large. But most of you probably know me from that time I taught hundreds of thousands of you how to play Victoria 2. Now, I'm collaborating with Paradox Interactive to teach you how to play its sequel, so you can call me Ezekiel. This is how to use buildings and infrastructure in Victoria 3. Let's jump in!
I don't like the way he says let's jump in. I don't have a problem with like other things in the video, but that just like...
Economic production in Victoria 3 happens in buildings. It doesn't matter whether it's something small like mining coal out of the ground or raising livestock.
To be fair, like trying to be excited, I think is a good look generally for producing content and can often just like come off as off, and so... It is what it is.
Or something big, like
it is what it is.
Building an advanced warplane at the end of an international multi-continental supply chain. It all happens in buildings.
So the construction center, he might be about to talk about this, but the construction center seems like the bread and butter for like getting stuff started in your economy, because it increases the demand for a good, especially if you're like a small nation that has their own internal market. It increases the demand for both timber and fabric, because it uses those as inputs. And so what you can do, I think, in a lot of these countries, just when you're trying to start out and trying to develop an economy where you have profitable manufacturers, is you can build construction centers, which allow you to build more buildings, and then immediately there's a high demand for both fabric and timber, and so you can build fabric, like cotton plantations, which I'm pretty sure are the ones that produce fabric, and then you build logging camps, and this way you know that the ones you're building are going to be profitable. They're going to employ pops. The pops are going to make a lot of money, and they're going to like drive consumption. And so this seems like a pretty good way to go about things at the very start.
At its simplest, a building is a facility in which pops of a certain type take input goods and turn them into output goods. These goods don't have to be consumed immediately, and can instead be used to create more advanced goods. This process will naturally create supply chains. The products of these supply chains are more luxurious, economically useful, and militarily powerful than their simpler counterparts. Each building has a level which correlates to its size. The higher the level, the bigger the building, which makes it more productive and allows it to employ more pops. Buildings also benefit from economies of scale, so
I've talked about this in other videos, but I think the economies of scale bonuses go up increasingly as you build more and more manufactories up until you have the 21st one, and the bonus is quite large. I'm not sure yet if the bonus is multiplicative with other bonuses or additive. If it is multiplicative, you are really going to want to concentrate your industries in one area. If it's additive, it's just kind of like a bit of nice cherry on top.
A single size 2 building will be more productive than 2 size 1s. Usually you upgrade the size of buildings manually, but you can set them to automatically upgrade when they're both profitable and the construction queue is empty. Buildings fall into 3.5 types: urban, rural, development, and construction. Let's start with the half, which is construction. I call it half because this is the only category with a single building in it, but it's also the most important. It's the construction center. Construction sectors are what you use to build and expand other buildings. Now, I wouldn't get too carried away with these. Building materials cost money, so just because you have the capacity to build lots of buildings doesn't mean you can afford to.
This, I think, is one of the main tensions of the game. Construction costs money, and this, I think, is the main reason why you want to intake money. Or there's only a few... You can look at what government expenditures are, and I think the early one, it's going to be construction, and then later on, it's going to be like you're buying goods for your government facilities. So, for example, bureaucratic administrations require paper, so you have to eat the paper. Um, barracks require military goods, so you have to eat those. And then, same with like shipperies or whatever. And then I think universities, the government's eating the cost, as well as all. I don't know if they're called policies, what exactly they're called, but when you institute a law where you get to pick the level, and so police, you could have increasingly up to like level 5 policing or whatever it is, this will increase government expenditures, but early on, I think it's mainly construction, and so this is where the tension of the game is you want to take money out of the economy to fund these things, but at the same time, when you take money out of the economy, you make the economy less productive and there's less money circulating, and so it's this tension where you want to do two things that are conflicting simultaneously.
Don't do something silly like build more construction sectors than you have the budget to use. Next are development buildings. This includes military buildings which raise and equip your armies, and infrastructure like ports and railroads. Ports increase infrastructure and produce convoys, while railroads increase infrastructure and produce transportation. Next are rural buildings. These tend to produce more basic goods: food, cash crops, coal and metal, and so on. They're also limited by a state's arable land and resource potentials. This is also where you'll find subsistence farms. Pops who can't find a building to work in will automatically build and work on a subsistence farm. But you really don't want them to do that because they hardly produce anything. The only benefit to subsistence farming is that it's literally better than nothing. At the start of the game, most of the world will be living and working on subsistence farms. Finally, we have urban buildings. This is where you'll find the advanced stuff like factories, government administrations, and universities. The latter two are worth special mention because government administrations are what produce all-important bureaucracy and tax capacity, while universities are vital for researching technology. The urban section also...
I wanted to pause on universities and take a closer look at them. Let's see. Per level modifier. The main reason I think getting qualifications when you're not like an industrialized, centralized power, I think is one of the things that's a bit difficult, and this is how you get qualifications. And so I think if you are playing as a country that is, let's say, a little bit backward, rushing universities early on is going to be important to make sure that you have enough machinists and stuff like this for your other industries. And I think that this is something that will kind of slap you like in an uncomfortable way, like 2 hours into your run when you realize you don't have enough machinists to go to the next production method on, whatever industry you're focusing on.
Also features a very unique building called an urban center. Most buildings, just by existing, produce urbanization. For every 100 units of urbanization, you get one free level of urban center in that state. The types of buildings you can construct are determined by your technology. The relevant technologies are mostly in the production tab, but all technologies, including society techs, are relevant here. This is because each building has production methods which can modify their efficiency.
And so, it looks like it's all producing groceries, but something I want to note is that the inputs become proportionally different. I know that canning, relative to jarring, for example, inputs more fish. And a question I have is, I don't know who the fisheries are owned by in terms of interest groups, but the farms, I believe, are owned by the landowners. And so, for example, if you wanted to disempower the landowners, it seems reasonable to go for canneries, because what you're going to do is you're going to fish more, which takes pressure off of grain and puts it on fish, and then canneries allow you to utilize that where you are changing the proportion of your inputs so that the input proportion is more in line with the fisheries and less in line with the grain, so you're trying to drive out the interest group. I think a lot of ways in which you try and resolve tension is going to be relative to the interest group, and so yeah.
And output. From this same screen, you can modify the building's own...
One moment. Okay, I am back.
Owner too. This determines who gets the building's dividends, which is...
So this is what I was talking about with, in terms of the farms early on are owned by the landowners. I assume the later production methods are less landowner heavy, but we'll see.
It's a fancy way of saying it's profits. There are multiple society technologies that allow you to change who owns and thus profits from a building. So that's it for your local economy. But you're not an isolationist, are you? There's a whole big world out there, and it has goods and resources unavailable in your little corner. But before you get too excited, we're not going to go over there and take those goods by force. At least not yet. First, we're going to learn how to do it consensually. So up next are markets and trade. I'll see you.
So that's the end of buildings and infrastructure. I think that he kind of glossed over the interest groups, or the effect of ownership that it would have on interest groups, because my understanding is generally the pops with the money are going to be the pops that control your government. And so this is a sort of tension that you can, or not tension, but the way you resolve the tension of pumping money into your economy versus extracting it for your government to spend is, I think you're going to want to screw over the interest groups you don't like and pump money into the interest groups you do like. Is kind of, I think, a good way to think about it. Time to look at Trade and Markets tutorial.
Hey folks, my name is Ezekiel Cohen, and I run the Call Me Ezekiel YouTube channel, where we create high-quality videos about history, philosophy, literature, and the humanities at large. But most of you probably know me from that time I taught hundreds of thousands of you how to play Victoria 2. Now, I'm collaborating with Paradox Interactive to teach you how to play its sequel, so you can call me Ezekiel. This is how to use markets and trade in Victoria 3. Let's jump in! Markets in Victoria 3 are great. Run out of money on the real stock.
Sorry, I gotta rewind. I think that he uses the exact same audio for his Let's Jump in every single one of these.
Great. Because when you run out of money on the real stock market, you can lose fake money by speculating in-game. You see, if Ludwig von Mises taught us anything, it's that centrally planning an economy is not only difficult, it's literally impossible. Without market prices, economic decisions are beyond human capacity. This same concept remains true in Victoria 3. Every good has a market price determined by supply and demand. These prices are unique to each market, which has its own supply and demand of goods. By default, each country is in its own market, but it's possible to create multinational markets by having subject states and by creating customs unions with free states.
I think this is going to be like a dynamic that changes a lot how you play when you are in another person's market, because it allows you to focus on industries in a way that you would not otherwise be allowed to. So, for example, my run I'm planning on doing is Tunis, which starts out as the Ottomans market, and I think I've been advocating for like producing timber and fabric early with just about every nation, but I think since I'm part of their market, if I produce timber and fabric inside the Ottomans market, which is way bigger than me, it won't actually really drive down the price of timber and fabric that much. And so I can get away with not producing it myself and maybe not support certain interest groups that are the interest groups that own the timber and fabric production, and instead just go straight into like something a bit more industrial like tooling or arms production is kind of the plan.
For example, the United Kingdom starts the game with a particularly large multi-continental market.
I think really interesting nations perhaps to play at the game start that are not overpowered but have a lot of things about them that make them nice to play, let's say, are going to be countries that are in the British market, because you will have access to the enormous British market, and so it'll be really forgiving in terms of supply and demand of goods, I think. And you'll also be really safe, because I don't think many people will be attacking the British early on, so it'll be a good way to kind of figure things out while still being inserted into a market. The other good option, I think, is Japan, which is completely isolated and is unlikely to get attacked, but at the same time, you have to control all of your stuff yourself. But this also means there's no external like powers that are just randomly really changing the price of a good in a way that is difficult to understand. It's entirely internal, so it's just all your effect of what you're doing.
Which is useful for reliably feeding its industry. Such is the benefit of having colonies all over the world. But you're not even limited to just your multinational market, because
One quick point about colonies is that I think that, so I was been talking about how the landowners own the farms. The pops that are in your unincorporated states, which includes your colonies, have much less political power. So it is possible that if you are trying to not build, like, let's say, grain farms because you don't want to increase the power of the landowners, you can just do this in your colonies because they are not going to have the same political clout with the colony production as they would from the incorporated state production.
It's possible to conduct unilateral trade with any qualifying nation. This is done via trade routes. A trade route can be used to import a good into your country or export goods to another. This means that if your market isn't making enough food, you can import the deficit from somewhere else. You can see what goods you're short on and by how much from the trade screen.
I think there will be certain instances where you just want to import to just decrease the price of a good because it's really, really cheaply produced elsewhere because they get special bonuses. Like Russia gets bonuses in wood production, and wood's an input for a lot of goods. So you just want to make the inputs cheaper so your factories are more profitable. And so it's possible you just want to import, not necessarily because you can't produce enough yourself, but to drive down the price of an input or a good that your pops consume.
Similarly, you can also use this screen to see what goods your market is overproducing and export them for a profit. Trade routes aren't free though. To maintain them will take up bureaucracy, and if your nations don't have a land connection between each other, it'll take up convoys too. Trade routes are also subject to international diplomacy, so don't import your national food and weapon supply from a country that you're about to go to war with, or one who hates and may embargo you. Trade routes can take some
I think you get a Diplo bonus from people you're interacting with in terms of trade, so you might actually want to trade with people who don't like you to try and improve your Diplo relations. Just as he was saying, not something you're hyper-dependent on.
Time to come online. Each trade route starts at level 1, which means it moves only a low volume of goods. Its level, and thus the volume of goods it transports, will increase if the route is profitable and decrease if it loses money. Trade centers, which are a development building, will automatically be created and destroyed in proportion to the needs of your trade network. Regardless of whether you're
So this can be something that maybe allows you to try and increase like a ton of shopkeepers, increase the number of, I don't know if that's petite bourgeoisie or what, but just trading a lot even if it's not profitable necessarily in order to drive up the price of shopkeepers. Also, I'm just noticing in this modifier now, migration attraction. And so it could be, I'm just seeing this now, but it could be the case that if you really want to change the population and grow a state, you should just trade a lot through it, even if it's not necessarily profitable for trade. And okay, so the question is why would trade not be profitable? And I think it's mainly because of, so you have to spend bureaucratic administration, so you have to eat paper in order to trade, right? Because your bureaucratic administrations have a paper input, you eat the paper. Now, if your pops are producing the paper, then maybe this is fine and you don't care that you're eating the paper, right? Because your pops are benefiting from this transaction. But just, first of all, you have to do that. And then, second of all, there's another reason why it's costly. Because you're paying tariffs. So when a company exports, they have an export tariff and you have an import tariff. So you have to pay, let's say 25% on the good when it's exported, and then another 25% when it gets there, right? You can eliminate the import tariff, but you can't eliminate the export tariff unless you have a trade agreement. And so this means that their government is just shaving some off the top. And so just something to think about, but you can institute trade even if it's not profitable for other reasons, both Diplo and apparently migration attraction, which is interesting to me because I'm going to try and really up the migration attraction of Tunis in my Tunis run, and the reason being is I'm part of the Ottomans market. And the way migration works is it's internally to a market, so I can try and sap off the pops of the Ottomans. I can drink their milkshake, as it were, drink up their pops. And so I think that this might be, I don't know how strong migration attraction is going to be as a modifier, because you have to play the game and see. But if it's a really strong modifier, it might be the case that you just try and create a trade hub, even if the trade hub is not that profitable, let's say.
Importing or exporting goods, you're very likely to profit off of trade routes via tariffs. Although, since tariffs are a tax on your pops, it's not actually making you richer.
This is a point I've been emphasizing a couple times. It's a matter of where you want the how you want to skim money off of your economy. I think you want to be selective, and you would want to try and impoverish some pops and also empower other pops. If you look at the taxation at the very bottom left, when the silly YouTube thing like goes down, or maybe it won't, there's a thing that says government wages down here. It could be possible, if you want to empower bureaucrats, you just increase government wages and you just take less, because if you increase their wages, they will consume more, which will drive up the price of domestic goods.
It's just moving some money around. But none of this even matters if your goods can't make it to market, and that's what market access is for. Each state has a market access rating. By default, it's at 100%.
So this could be a reason, this market access could be a reason why you don't necessarily want to play a run inside the British market, because it might be really annoying because you have low market access.
Which means that's functioning normally. However, each state has a limited amount of infrastructure, and buildings need that infrastructure to operate. If the total infrastructure usage exceeds the supply, then the state's economy will suffer penalties in proportion to how overused the infrastructure is. To increase market access in coastal states, you can build ports, but inland states will need railroads. So now that you finally have a functioning economy, it's time to tax the hell out of it, and spend it on something silly.
So the reason why it's market access is like relevant is because it's all about connection to the trade center of the market, or the trade capital of the market, which normally, if you're playing your own independent market country, it's your capital. I think you can move it, but I'm not sure. But if you're playing like as a British subject, the capital is London, right? So you have to make sure you have infrastructure back to London, not back to your own capital, which might be annoying. I'm not sure how annoying, but this maybe is something to check when you like load into a game as Canada. You just look at, your market, or just gonna go back in here because I forget the term. Infrastructure. It's not infrastructure. Okay, your market access. It may be the case that Canada just has terrible market access, and maybe that would make it unfun to play. This is something to think about if you're thinking about playing as a subject of Britain, which I actually think is going to be, a nice start. All right, so that's all for trade and markets. Now we're going to jump in the wealth tutorial. We're going to switch this to theater mode, and we're off.
Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and you may know me from my own YouTube channel where I cover strategy games similar to Victoria 3 extensively. Today I'm collaborating with Paradox Interactive to introduce you to a core concept about the economy in Victoria 3. Income. We'll be discussing where it comes from, what it affects, and where it goes. First, it's important to understand that the population of your nation is
comprised of video crashes.
Of pops of different categories. They are grouped together based on their type, and further, their culture, faith, location, and place of employment, with standard of living.
This is interesting to see. Clerks are intelligentsia, clergy is... It looks like this is whatever religious one and peasant one. Machinists are trade union, and shopkeepers are industrialists. Machinists go up as you go to increasingly more difficult production methods. And so my understanding is the mid-game, the industrialists get really powerful, and late game, it's the unions and the intelligentsia mainly. Just something to keep in mind in terms of which pops.
Accumulated wealth and income of your people tracked along the lines of these groupings. And it's worth noting, however, that these groups are further divided in a few different ways, but what's most relevant to us today is the division between workforce and dependence. The workforce is the part of the pop group that is able to work, taking on jobs to generate the bulk of the pop group's income. Dependents are families of these workers who are not able to work for one reason or another. They might have been maimed in battle, or perhaps your nation's laws prevent them from working because they are women, or children, or perhaps too old. Dependents are still able to generate some amount of income, but they only do so for specific pop types and at a fraction of what somebody in the workforce earns. Between the workforce and the dependents, you'll see income of a few different kinds, further influenced by the pop type and wealth level.
Interestingly, I think the dependent is something to think about when going to war, because if, let's say 10% of a group becomes dependent because they were injured in battle, then the group their standard of living will plummet, right? Because they have to the ones that are still working have to pay for all the dependents. And so this is kind of an effect that is going to be quite subtle. But I think if you go to wars a lot and you just eat a ton of pop damage, you're going to make your people much less, you're going to decrease their standard of living a lot. And so maybe something to do is like post-war, decrease taxes or something like this to try and compensate for this sort of thing. If having a slow, steady growth curve on your standard of living is something you want to try and encourage. And so maybe you do for like several months after you just take off the tax and then you put it back on. I don't know. This is just something to think about.
Dependent wages are, as described earlier, the marginal income generated by qualifying family members of the workforce, only available to specific pop types. Interest, meanwhile, is generated as income for people who have lent money to the government. That's you. This form of income really only comes up when your nation has used up all of its gold reserves and is relying on loans from the populace to stay afloat. Not a sustainable approach, but the moneylenders will happily collect. Finally, subsistence output, wages, and dividends.
I think it's super interesting that the amount of interest and loans you can take comes from the buildings themselves and how much money they have stored.
Are the three forms of income that the workforce generates that you'll have more direct control over right from the start of your game, and they're determined by the population type and the building at which they work. Each building in Victoria 3 employs multiple different types of pops. The types are determined by the building itself and by the production methods you've set it to use. By building specific buildings and setting their production methods in.
So this is something I've been talking about earlier, where you want to try and focus on industries that are in line with the interest groups you are interested in. And so if you're playing as a kind of backward nation, trying to avoid producing stuff that requires a lot of landowners. The unfortunate thing is you need those goods, so what are you going to do,
In specific ways, you can have a direct influence over which people are getting job opportunities and how wealth is distributed in your nation. It's important to note, however, that just because a pop is employed doesn't mean they're making good money. While military and government employees have their wages determined by your own policies in the budget screen, private sector employees receive wages based on how well their employing building is performing and their role at the building.
So this is, I think, something that to keep in mind. Sometimes you will want goods to be expensive because it makes the buildings more profitable, and it makes the people who profit off of the building be more profitable, more money. And so if let's say the only building in your entire country that has an interest group you want, let's say it's arms manufacturers, you actually want the price of the good to be really expensive, because this will make the people more money, and it'll also allow you to build more arms manufacturers. And so keeping all the prices low isn't just necessarily a good thing.
Owners of a building, as determined by the ownership production method, will receive dividends when the building has a positive weekly balance.
Notably, new tech gives new ownership production method. I think, for example, logging, regular logging, I believe, is owned by the landowners, but once you add sawmills, then it's owned by the industrialists. And so this can be something to think about in terms of what techs you're researching and how you're looking about expanding certain production of certain goods.
Beyond that, both they and the other employees of the building will receive wages proportional to their pop type and how profitable the building is. As you can imagine, a building tries to keep wages as low as possible to maximize profit margins, but people will seek out higher wages at other buildings, and if they have the right qualifications, they'll even change their pop type to transition to a higher wage. It's not uncommon to see people migrate for better wages either. All of these factors encourage buildings to offer competitive wages.
This migration attraction of specifically higher education pops, I think, is something to think about if you're operating inside another country's market. So let's say you make a bunch of jobs that are machinist jobs and they're paying a lot in your country. Let's say you're playing as Tunis. You can kind of use that to try and suck the machinists out of the Ottoman, who is your overlord, out of the Ottoman's market. I think you will probably have to eat some inefficiency in doing this, but it might be worth it.
Wages as they strive to maintain the balance between a full workforce and the lowest wages they can pay in an effort to maximize their sales and resulting profits. A building that's able to sell its products at higher prices will provide higher wages and generate more income through dividends for their owners as well. Meanwhile, if a building is struggling to maintain a full workforce as a result of low productivity that in turn reduces profitability, you might want to provide government subsidies to it. This helps the business cover its costs so that wages still get paid, and while it means the national treasury is taking a bit of a hit, it might be just the boost a business needs to become successful, and it might be the difference between starvation and stability for the people who would otherwise be laid off or underpaid by the building.
Something I want to quickly note is this grocer has two outputs. And one of the outputs is groceries, and the other output is alcohol. If you are, let's say, playing as a Muslim country, your pops are not consuming the alcohol. What you can do is export the alcohol and remove the export tariff and try and drive up the price of alcohol. When you drive up the price of alcohol, that will make these buildings more profitable, which allows you to build more, which allows you to increase the supply of groceries, driving down the price of groceries. And so this, I've mentioned this a couple times before, but this dual output thing lets you, is I think one of the levers on which you can institute some control over what's going on. And so it might be the case that you're getting huge edges in the game by doing something like this, so that your pops get super cheap groceries, standard of living increases, education increases, your pops are still very profitable at these like food industries and this sorts of thing.
Subsistence output, meanwhile, comes from subsistence farms on unused arable land, providing an additional form of income. Subsistence output is generated through the sale of products directly by the peasants working the farms. It only applies to the peasants working at subsistence farms, and it is a marginal amount to help keep them afloat. While some of your population will just be staying afloat, others...
Something that's interesting is marginal, like, has a very definitive economics understanding. It is an additional unit, and just in the context of a hyper-economic game, the colloquial understanding of marginal, which is just small, is a bit, I don't know what the word jarring, let's say, because, you have to figure out which meaning they're using. Or, well, like, it's easy to infer that it just means small, but, okay.
Others will earn enough to aspire for greater things. One of the major impacts of income kicks in when it is higher than a particular pop group's expenses by a significant margin. As this surplus income accumulates, you'll see the pop group make progress towards the next wealth level higher up. On the flip side, if they...
So this is, I think, you want to try and enrich pops, because as they get more wealthy, they get more political power, so you want to enrich pops, and you want to enrich specific pops, because the pops, as they get enriched, they will also increase consumption, which increases demand of goods, which makes all your industries more profitable, and so money going to your pops is, like, it's coming up over and over, and it's, like, important to emphasize. It's a good thing, and you just want them to be going to the right pops.
Income is lower than expenses, and there is a deficit net income, you'll see progress towards the next wealth level lower down. Wealth level is the biggest determining factor in a pop group's standard of living, and each pop group has an expectation for the lowest their standard of living should be. Going below that level might trigger significant unrest, radicalization, and revolution.
It's interesting to note that the level is also relative to where they're at, or relative to where they've been at recently, and it is not an absolute sort of scale.
Especially if the pop group is politically influential. Even when above the minimum, shifts in standard of living will make radicals or loyalists out of members in the pop group, depending on if the standard of living shifted down or up respectively, and a higher standard of living will encourage growth rates and the likelihood of immigration for that pop group into your nation. The wealth level of a pop group will also determine its access to education, and a higher literacy rate increases your research rates and allows pops to transition to specific types that have prerequisite literacy rates as well. And that's not all. Wealth has a direct influence on the political strength a pop might have, which in turn impacts the kinds of policies you'll be able to enact.
Again, all of this points to you really wanting certain pops to become wealthy, and so ways you can kind of like game the system to try and make them wealthier faster than they otherwise would be able to are going to benefit you in terms of politics.
While that's a longer conversation for a later video, as you
is.
can see, the income your population makes determines their social, political, economic, and geographical mobility, but it also impacts the expenses they might have to take on. Depending on your policies, laws, and budgetary settings, your populace will likely have to pay a variety of types of taxes. Consumption tax can be applied to a variety of products to make them more expensive.
I think it's notable that income tax at the start of the game, for a lot of countries, especially the more backward ones, is regressive, which means that it taxes the poor populations more. And so acquiring money from your government through income tax when it's regressive is probably not going to be something you want, because you don't want to tax the lowest strata the most. You want to tax the upper strata the most. And so early on, especially in more backward countries, I think you're going to want to go for the consumption taxes, as this guy's mentioning, not the income tax.
Expensive to purchase while generating income for the government. The most common form of consumption tax.
So if you looked at this guy's, what he's got going on right now, you'll notice that his tax is below baseline, the taxation level, and that he's instituting consumption taxes. So this might be a strong strategy for making it so that the lower level strata, because the taxation level is regressive, you increase the lower level strata standard of living, and you kind of hurt the upper level strata standard of living, but it's a lot harder to hurt them because they're much wealthier.
Common form of consumption tax you might be familiar with is the sin tax, an extra fee for the purchase of alcohol and other intoxicants like tobacco products. Dividend taxes, income taxes, poll taxes, land taxes, and per capita taxes are only applied if the suitable laws have been enacted, and once again, you'll want to make policy choices based on how you want the wealth to flow in your nation. Keep in mind that the actual tax you collect from your population is collected at a per state level, and each state will have a taxation capacity that represents its ability to efficiently tax the people living within. Each point of taxation capacity.
So taxation capacity is going to be an interesting sort of thing where you are, you might have enough bureaucratic administration so that bureaucracy as a resource, your bureaucratic capacity is not a concern, but you don't have enough bureaucratic administrations to have good taxation capacity, and so it might be the case that you want to overbuild on the bureaucratic administrations, in which case you need to find ways to use your increased capacity, because you're going to be way over capacity. Also, when you overbuild, when you build more bureaucratic administrations than necessary, you make yourself vulnerable to increases in the price of paper, because you are eating paper to keep those going.
Capacity means the state can effectively tax 10,000.
You'll also eat more than paper with the later production methods, just the earlier ones that I've gotten to see from these playthroughs have been paper.
People. You can build government administration buildings to increase taxation capacity at a per state level using alternative.
So if we look here, the lower level one, I can't see the input, or I can't read it, but it looks like, you know, it's paper for the filing cabinets and such.
Production methods to further increase taxation capacity. Alternatively, you can research technologies that bolster taxation capacity nationwide. Do not underestimate the value of taxation capacity. If it falls behind, you might be leaving a lot of money on the table.
My understanding, based on what some of the devs said, I think during the Japan playthrough, is that when you fail to tax a pop, or your taxation capacity doesn't fully extract the wealth, that money is just lost. It doesn't stay in the pops and they get to consume more. It's just a dead weight loss. It's just like complete loss. And so it might be the case that you really, really want to avoid this. This is if I recall correctly, which I think I do. So the pops lose the money no matter what on the tax. And if you don't have the taxation capacity, not only do the pops lose it, you as the government do not get it. And so it might be the case you actually really want to go out of your way to avoid this, because you don't really mind not getting the money yourself if your pops are getting to spend more money and it circulate money through your economy. But if your pops aren't, this might be a very bad thing for you. And so, a subtle bad thing, but a bad thing.
The most significant contributor to expenses, though, is almost always going to be a pop's needs. Making sure a pop group is able to fulfill its needs while holding on to some of its income is crucial if you want to elevate the group beyond their current status, and navigating the needs of your pops is a conversation we'll set aside for next time.
The needs being consumption. So I was planning on just banging out all these videos, but this video itself is getting fairly long, so I will split this up into 2 parts. This is the end of part 1, concluding with the income and wealth tutorial with Party Elite. If you like this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. I'm planning to, on release, being streaming my Tunis run, so keep an eye out for that if that sounds interesting. I have a lot of thoughts and ideas on that, and I will be explaining what I'm doing and why I'm doing it throughout the play. Also, if you have not stood up or taken any sort of movement in the last couple hours, you've just been sitting at the computer, maybe stand up and take a walk. Good for your health, this sort of thing, and have a good day.